The air within the great hall of consciousness hung heavy, thick with the scent of ancient parchment and the electric hum of 1,000 unspoken questions. Here, the seekers gathered men and women who had crossed deserts of despair and climbed mountains of discipline, all for the sake of a single elusive secret. They expected a ritual. They expected a labyrinthine journey through arcane symbols and a slow, agonizing ascent toward a distant epiphany. They had prepared their minds for a marathon of the soul, bracing for a dramatic reveal that would only come after the sun had set on their patience. The master architect stood before them, bathed not in the flickering glow of candlelight, but in a stark, uncompromising clarity. He did not offer a prologue. He did not recite a lineage of sages. Instead, he broke the first rule of the dramatic arts. He gave them the ending before the beginning. "Good evening." The voice resonated, not as a whisper, but as a tectonic shift. "I want to begin tonight with something unusual. I want to give you the answer first, not at the end, not after a long build-up, not as the dramatic reveal you have to sit through an hour to receive. Right now, in the first minute before I've said almost anything else, here it is. Stop feeding doubt your attention. Return to your assumption. Do it within 30 seconds. That is the entire teaching for tonight." A collective tremor rippled through the hall. It was a pattern interruption so violent it felt like a physical blow. The seekers, who had spent lifetimes sharpening their intellects for a battle with a complex monster, were suddenly handed a simple key and told the door was already unlocked. The paradox hung in the air like a shimmering veil. If the solution is this effortless, why has the struggle been so monumental? The silence that followed was not empty. It was pressurized. In that 30-second window, the architect watched the minds of the audience. He saw the instinctive reach for complexity, the way the human ego recoils from simplicity as if it were an insult. He saw them searching for the catch, the hidden fine print, the "but what about" that would justify their years of paralysis. To the observer, this was the first evidence of the very disease they had come to cure. The belief that truth must be earned through exhaustion. Why does the human mind flee from the simple? Why do we perceive a 30-second redirection as an impossibility while we view a 30-year struggle as a noble necessity? To understand this, one must peer into the recursive depths of the psyche, asking the why until the foundation of the ego begins to crack. We hoard complexity because complexity provides a hiding place. If the solution to our life stagnation is a convoluted 12-step process requiring years of monastic devotion, then our failure to manifest is not a choice, it is a casualty of the process. Complexity serves as a psychological buffer, a way to stay in the waiting room of life without ever having to step onto the stage. We treat our doubt with a kind of misplaced reverence, viewing it as logical or proportionate to our circumstances. Consider the mirror. When one stands before a mirror and sees a smudge of soot upon their brow, they do not attempt to scrub the glass. They do not analyze the chemical composition of the smudge or write a thesis on how the soot came to be. They simply reach up and wipe their own skin. Yet, in the realm of consciousness, the world is the mirror and doubt is the smudge. Instead of correcting the self, the source, we spend our lives frantically scrubbing the glass of the external world, arguing with the reflection, and wondering why the smudge remains. How does doubt sustain its life? It operates like the radio dial. At any given moment, the atmosphere is thick with infinite frequencies: music, news, static, and silence. You do not fight the static to hear the symphony. You simply tune the dial to a different coordinate. Doubt is merely a frequency of static. It has no power to silence the music. It only has the power to occupy your speakers if you choose to remain tuned to its coordinate. The why of our struggle is rooted in the how of our attention. We have been conditioned to believe that attention is a passive response to reality. We think, I doubt, because the bank account is empty. But the reverse is the metaphysical truth. The bank account remains empty because the consciousness is tuned to the frequency of empty. By engaging with the doubt, by arguing with it, analyzing it, and trying to fix it, you are effectively pressing your ear against the speaker of the static and complaining that you cannot hear the song. This is the recursive trap. The instinct to reach for complexity is itself a product of the very pattern we are dismantling. The moment you think, it can't be that simple, you have just fed the doubt. You have given it another 30 seconds of oxygen. In the ancient city of Oakhaven, there lived a man named Julian, who was known as the greatest locksmith in the empire. It was said that Julian could open any door, crack any vault, and unbind any chain. He spent 40 years studying the physics of iron and the geometry of tumblers. He owned 1,000 tools, each more intricate than the last, and his mind was a library of mechanical complexity. One day, the king, seeking to test Julian's reputation, cast him into the inescapable cell, a chamber deep beneath the earth. The door was a massive slab of black iron, featuring a lock so complex it had 3 keyholes and a series of rotating dials. The king told him, "If you can unlock this door, you shall be my vizier. If you fail, you shall remain here until you understand why." Julian set to work immediately. He used his finest picks. He listened to the click of the tumblers with a stethoscope. He mapped out the internal gears in his mind. Hour after hour, he wrestled with the lock. He felt the weight of the iron, the coldness of the mechanism, and the daunting complexity of the king's design. He analyzed the history of the king's locksmiths. He debated with himself about the tension of the springs. He grew exhausted, his fingers bleeding, his mind spinning with what-ifs. What if the lock is rigged? What if I need a tool I don't have? What if I am not the master I thought I was? For 22 hours, Julian fought the door. He treated the lock as a worthy, formidable opponent. He gave the complexity of the mechanism his absolute, unwavering attention. He fed the problem with every ounce of his genius. Finally, at the 23rd hour, Julian collapsed in total surrender. He sat on the cold floor, his tools scattered, and simply looked at the door. He stopped trying to solve it. He stopped arguing with the iron. In that moment of profound silence, a thought flickered. What if I just leaned on it? Julian stood up. He didn't reach for a pick. He didn't look at the keyhole. He simply placed his hand on the door and gave it a gentle, disinterested push. The door swung open with a soft groan. It had never been locked. The intricate dials, the 3 keyholes, the rotating tumblers, they were all a facade, a theatrical display designed to engage his mind and keep him from the simple truth. The inescapable cell was only inescapable because Julian had committed himself to the reality of the lock. He had spent 22 hours validating a barrier that did not exist. The king stood on the other side, smiling. "You were not imprisoned by the iron, Julian. You were imprisoned by your respect for the difficulty. You gave the obstacle 30 uncontested minutes of your focus, and in those minutes you built the wall yourself." The master architect looked out at the seekers in the hall. "You are Julian," he said, his voice cutting through the lingering echoes of the story. "Every doubt that enters your mind is a dial on a door that is already unlocked. The moment you engage with it, the moment you try to pick the lock of your anxiety, you are closing the door and bolting it from the inside. To embody this truth today, you must become a doubt hunter. This is not a role of aggression, but one of swift, cold efficiency. You do not need 1,000 tools. You need a stopwatch. When the thought arrives, the money isn't coming, the relationship is failing, I am not enough, treat it not as a problem to be solved, but as a flicker of light on a wall. It is the shadow. A shadow cannot hurt you, unless you become so afraid of it that you run off a cliff to escape it. As you sit with the weight of this realization, ask yourself, how much of my life have I spent building the very walls I am now trying to climb? If you are ready to stop building and start walking through the open doors, perhaps it is time to align your journey with this frequency. Like and subscribe to this transmission to ensure your internal sentry stays awake. The practice is this. When the doubt appears, you have 5 seconds to name it. There is a shadow. You do not ask why it is there. You do not check if it has grown. You then have 5 seconds to dismiss it with a phrase of utter indifference. Not my reality. Or simply, no. The remaining 20 seconds are for the return. You must pivot the radio dial of your consciousness back to the frequency of the wish fulfilled. Do not try to believe it, inhabit it. Feel the texture of the already done. Total elapsed time, 30 seconds. In that half minute, you have denied the seed of doubt the soil it needs to germinate. You have refused to let the shadow become a solid. But be warned, the mind is a creature of habit. It will try to lure you back into the courtroom. It will tell you that some doubts are too important to ignore. It will tell you that your house is divided against itself. And it is that division, that internal war between the version of you that has and the version of you that lacks, that we must examine next. For even if you master the 30-second rule, you must understand the architecture of the house you are living in. The door is open, but are you living in the basement of your past or the penthouse of your assumption? We shall find out in the next chapter, The House Divided. Imagine a grand theater, an architectural marvel of gold leaf and crimson velvet, where the very air vibrates with the anticipation of a masterpiece. The lights dim, the conductor raises his baton, and the performance begins. But as the first notes swell, a jarring discord shatters the harmony. On the left side of the stage, a troupe of actors performs a triumphant epic of a king returning to his rightful throne, laden with the spoils of victory and the adoration of his people. On the right side, occupying the exact same space, another troupe performs a bleak tragedy of a beggar shivering in the rain, forgotten by time and stripped of hope. The dialogue overlaps in a chaotic cacophony. The king's proclamation of "I have arrived" is strangled by the beggar's moan of "I have nothing." The audience, the silent, witnessing consciousness, is seized by a paralyzing vertigo. The mind attempts to watch both plays at once, to validate both the crown and the rags, the feast and the famine. This is not a struggle of will, it is a structural collapse of reality. The paradox of the human condition lies here. A man prays for rain while simultaneously carrying an umbrella to protect himself from the very sun he claims is his enemy. He stands in the center of his life and declares, with equal conviction, two opposing truths. I am wealthy, his spirit whispers in the silence of meditation. I am broke, his eyes scream as they scan the cold digits of a bank statement. This is the house divided, a structure built upon a fault line where the tectonic plates of having and not having grind against one another. A house divided against itself cannot stand, but more importantly, it cannot move. It is a ship with its engines screaming at full throttle, while its massive iron anchors remain buried deep in the silt of the harbor floor. The tragedy is not that the ship is weak. The tragedy is that the ship is trying to be in two places at once, at sea and at the dock. Until the consciousness chooses a single shore to inhabit, it remains a ghost in its own theater, haunted by a play it refuses to end. To solve the crisis of the divided mind, one must move past the symptoms and interrogate the very source of belief. Why does the mind find it so effortless to sustain the tragedy while the epic feels like a fragile lie? Why is the empty more real than the full? The answer lies in the recursive nature of attention. We must ask, why do we give the physical evidence of our senses the final word? We do so because we have mistaken the echo for the voice. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast canyon. You shout a word of power, abundance, and wait. A moment later, the canyon returns the sound. But if you have spent the last 20 years shouting scarcity, the canyon is still busy returning the old echoes of your previous cries. When you hear the echo of scarcity today, you assume it is a fresh report of the current weather. You say, "See, the canyon says I am poor." But the canyon has no voice of its own. It is merely a mechanical reflector of what was. How does this division manifest as doubt? It manifests because the consciousness is incapable of functioning in two states simultaneously. It is a biological and metaphysical law. You cannot be both the victor and the victim in the same heartbeat. When you attempt to hold both, the mind enters a state of high-frequency oscillation, a wavering that exhausts the soul. But why does the not having usually win this tug of war? It wins because of weight. In the internal landscape, weight is not measured in pounds, but in familiarity. The physical world, the empty bed, the aching body, the overdue bill is heavy because it has been fed the most attention. It has the gravity of history. The wish fulfilled, by contrast, feels light and ethereal, like a dream that might dissipate upon waking. Consciousness, seeking stability, always defaults to the heavier assumption. It lands on the reality that feels most solid, most real. Therefore, doubt is not an intellectual error. It is a gravitational one. It is the result of a mind that has allowed the shadow to become more substantial than the light that casts it. We look at the mirror of our current circumstances, and seeing a reflection we dislike, we begin to believe that the reflection is the master and we are the servant. We ask, how can I be happy when the mirror shows me sadness? Failing to realize that the mirror is incapable of initiating a single movement. It can only follow. The division occurs the moment we wait for the mirror to smile before we allow ourselves the joy of the grin. In the golden age of sail, there was a legendary merchant vessel named the Sovereign. Her captain, a man of singular vision named Elias, had received a royal commission to sail to the fabled Isles of Spices, a place where the sands were gold and the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and cloves. The Sovereign was a masterpiece of oak and canvas. But Elias's crew was composed of men who had never left the gray, salt-cracked docks of the home port. They were men of the evidence of things seen. On the first day of the voyage, Elias stood on the quarterdeck, his eyes fixed on the horizon, already tasting the wealth of the isles. He was living in the state of the wish fulfilled. But below decks, the crew huddled in fear. They looked at the empty cargo holds vast, hollow caverns of wood, and they felt the weight of that emptiness. To them, an empty hold was a death sentence. "Captain," the first mate argued, "we have no spices. We have no gold. The hold is empty. How can you say we are rich when the evidence of the ship proves we are paupers?" Elias smiled, a distant look in his eyes. "The hold is not empty, Mr. Thorne. It is merely waiting. In my mind, the scent of the cloves is already so strong I can hardly breathe. We are a spice ship. That is our identity." But the crew could not live in the captain's vision. They were a house divided. While Elias commanded the sails to be set for the isles, the crew, in their secret terror, would sneak to the stern at night and drop the anchors of reality. They believed that by anchoring the ship, they were staying safe within the sight of the known shore. The Sovereign became a theater of the absurd. By day, the sails strained against the masts, white and pregnant with the wind of Elias's intent. By night, the ship shuddered and groaned as the secret anchors bit into the mud. For weeks, the ship stayed in the same patch of gray water, caught between the captain's I have and the crew's I don't have. The ship began to break. The masts cracked under the opposing pressures. The hull leaked. It was not a storm from the outside that threatened to sink them. It was the internal tension of two competing assumptions. One part of the ship was already at the Isles. The other part refused to leave the dock. It was only when Elias gathered the crew and forced them to look, not at the empty hold, but at the compass of the assumption, that the shift occurred. He didn't argue with the emptiness. He simply forbade the mention of the dock. He made them scrub the decks as if they were already laden with gold. He made them cook with the meager rations as if they were preparing a feast for the king of spices. He gave them 30 seconds to catch any word of empty and replace it with full. Slowly, the familiarity of the full ship became heavier than the memory of the empty port. The anchors were finally hauled in, not by force, but because the crew no longer believed they were necessary for safety. The Sovereign didn't just sail, it flew. The lesson of the Sovereign is the mandate for your own life. You cannot sail to your Isles of Spices while secretly dropping the anchors of, "But look at my current reality." You must stop being the reasonable man who respects the evidence of the empty hold. To integrate this truth, you must become the captain of your own radio dial. Understand that the not having and the having are two different stations playing at the same time. The reason the tragedy sounds louder is simply because you have the volume turned up. The practical integration. For the next 24 hours, treat your consciousness as a sovereign territory with a strict border policy. When you feel the wavering, that sick, sliding feeling of the divided house, apply the 30-second rule with surgical precision. Identify the anchor. Recognize that you are currently validating not having. For example, I am looking at my debt and calling it my identity. Cut the cable. Use your 5-second dismissal. That is the echo, not the voice. Flood the hold. Spend the remaining 25 seconds inhabiting the weight of the wish fulfilled. Feel the heaviness of the gold in your ship. Make the desired state so familiar that the physical lack feels like a strange, fading dream. The path to a unified mind is not found in the strength of your struggle, but in the consistency of your choice. If you feel the anchors of your old life lifting, acknowledge this transformation by liking and subscribing. Your engagement is the signal to the universe that you are no longer a passenger but the commander of your destiny. But do not be deceived. As you begin to lift these anchors, the shadow will fight back. It will attempt to draw you into a battle. It will tell you that you must fight your doubt, that you must wrestle it to the ground and conquer it with the sword of your will. Beware the urge to fight, for in the kingdom of the mind, what you fight, you feed. The sword is a tool of division, and we are seeking unity. In our next movement, we shall discover why the warrior's path is the way of the prisoner, and how to win without ever drawing a blade. Prepare for the futility of the sword. The arena was vast, a subterranean coliseum carved from the cold obsidian bedrock of the subconscious. In the center stood the warrior, lungs burning, sweat-stinging eyes that had not blinked in an eternity. His armor, once polished to a mirror sheen, was now dented and dull, covered in the gray dust of a war that had no end. In his hand he gripped the sword of affirmation, a blade forged from 10,000 repetitions of I am, yet its edge felt inexplicably blunt. Before him loomed the enemy, a towering, shifting mass of smoke and whispers known as the Great Doubt. It had no face, yet it wore 1,000 masks, the face of the empty bank statement, the silhouette of the departed lover, the cold sneer of the critic. The warrior lunged. He swung his blade with the fury of a man possessed, stacking his mental defenses like sandbags against an encroaching flood. He shouted his truths into the abyss, his voice hoarse from the effort of convincing himself. But with every strike, a sickening paradox unfolded. The harder the warrior swung, the more solid the enemy became. Every blow landed not on flesh, but on a vacuum that inhaled his strength, and exhaled a more potent version of the very fear he sought to slay. He was trapped in a lethal dance where his own exertion acted as the fuel for his opponent's fire. The more he resisted, the more the enemy persisted, gaining mass and momentum from the very hand that sought its destruction. This is the hidden tragedy of the spiritual aspirant, the belief that the good fight must be fought with the weapons of the world. We have been taught that to overcome a thing, we must confront it, grapple with it, and subdue it. We treat our doubt as a barbarian at the gates, failing to realize that by bolting the door and sharpening our spears, we have just granted that barbarian the status of a king. We are swinging a steel blade at a shadow, and in the exhaustion of the struggle, we forget that a shadow has no power to wound unless we provide the light that gives it form. Why does the sword fail? Why does the most disciplined defense often lead to the most crushing defeat? To answer this, we must descend into the recursive depths of the why, peeling back the layers of the mind until we reach the raw nerve of creation. Why do we fight? We fight because we are afraid. We perceive doubt as a predator, an external force capable of stealing our wish fulfilled. We believe that if we do not answer its questions, those questions will become the truth. We view doubt as a trial where we must present evidence to a judge to prove our worthiness. Why is this a trap? Because consciousness is not a courtroom, it is an echo chamber. In the physics of the mind, engagement is the equivalent of existence. When you spend 30 minutes in a mental battle, constructing counter-arguments and reciting affirmations like incantations to ward off a curse, you are performing an act of legitimization. You do not build a fortress against a butterfly. You do not deploy a phalanx against a breeze. The very act of deploying a defense is a subconscious confession. There is something here worth defending against. There is a threat that is real. Consciousness, the silent observer, does not hear the words of your affirmations. It feels the vibration of your struggle. It registers the weight of your focus. If you are fighting doubt, consciousness registers war. And because consciousness always creates the physical equivalent of its dominant state, it dutifully produces more reasons to fight, more obstacles to overcome, and more evidence that the enemy is real. How does this feed the shadow? Imagine the radio dial. Doubt is a low-frequency broadcast of static. When you fight the static by screaming at the radio or trying to dismantle the speakers, you are still giving 100% of your attention to the noise. You are still tuned to the frequency of the static. The how of your failure is simple. You are trying to change the music without moving the dial. You are attempting to defeat the static within its own frequency, which is a mathematical impossibility. This is the recursive thinking we must master. The observation, I feel doubt. The recursive why. Why do I feel the need to fight it? Answer, because I think it can stop my manifestation. The deeper why. Why do I think it has that power? Answer, because I believe my reality is determined by my thoughts about circumstances rather than my internal assumption. The resolution. If the internal assumption is the only reality, then the doubt is a non-event. To fight it is to grant it a throne it does not own. The sword is futile, because the sword requires an opponent. The moment you drop the sword, the opponent ceases to be an enemy and returns to what it truly is, a passing cloud, a harmless ripple in the vast ocean of your being. In the Chronicles of the Iron Kingdom, there is a tale of Sir Caelan, a knight of peerless courage who sought the Grail of Sovereignty. The Grail was said to be hidden within the Whispering Woods, a place where no traveler had ever returned. Legends spoke of horrific wraiths that guarded the path monsters of such terrifying visage that men died of fright before they could draw their breath. Caelan entered the woods with his great sword drawn, his heart a drum of defiance. Within minutes the whispers began. They spoke of his failures, his hidden shames, and the impossibility of his quest. Suddenly a wraith erupted from the mist, a skeletal nightmare with eyes of burning coal. Caelan struck. His blade passed through the creature as if it were smoke, but the creature struck back with a claw of cold ice that left a mark upon his soul. Caelan fought for hours. He was a master of the blade, but for every wraith he slew, two more emerged from the darkness. The woods seemed to grow thicker, the air colder, and the monsters more substantial with every drop of sweat he shed. He was doing everything a knight was trained to do. He was resisting evil, he was standing his ground, and he was using his strength to defend his purpose. Near death, Caelan fell to his knees in a clearing. He looked at his sword, the sword of will, and realized it was the very thing anchoring the monsters to his world. He noticed that when he paused to catch his breath, the wraiths slowed. When he screamed in defiance, they shrieked in power. In a moment of radical clarity, Caelan did the unthinkable. He didn't just stop fighting. He let go of the blade. He watched it sink into the moss. He closed his eyes and returned to the feeling of the Grail, the warmth of its gold, the peace of its presence. He assumed the state of the man who already possessed the treasure. A wraith lunged at him, its claws inches from his throat. Caelan did not move, he did not argue, he did not defend. He simply remained indifferent to the phantom's existence, his attention anchored firmly in the reality of the Grail. He felt a cold breeze pass through him, not over him. When he opened his eyes, the clearing was empty. The sun filtered through the leaves. The wraiths had not been defeated, they had simply dissolved. They were hollow, creatures woven from the thread of his own resistance. He walked the rest of the way in silence, the path opening before him, not because he had cleared it with a sword, but because he had stopped populating it with his fear. Sir Caelan's victory was not one of strength, but of direction. He learned that the only way to win against a shadow is to stop looking at the darkness and turn toward the light. To integrate this today, you must practice the art of passive sovereignty. You must realize that when doubt arrives, it is a job interview for your attention. The doubt is the applicant, and it is desperate for the position. If you argue with it, you are giving it an interview. If you try to prove it wrong, you are giving it an interview. Even if you fire it with anger, you are still acknowledging its presence in the building. The practical ritual of non-resistance. Today, when the familiar "but what if," or "it's not working," whispers in the corridors of your mind, do not reach for your sword. Do not try to fix the thought. Drop the blade. Internalize the realization that this thought has zero power to change your reality unless you hire it with your attention. The disinterested turn. Act like a high-status monarch who has been interrupted by a buzzing fly. You don't call the army, you don't even look at the fly. You simply continue your conversation with the wish fulfilled. The 3-0 second pivot. This is the bridge to our next discipline. Use the window of 30 seconds to move from the static to the symphony. If you are beginning to feel the weight of the sword leaving your hand and the lightness of true sovereignty taking its place, honor this shift. Like and subscribe to these transcripts to ensure you never again mistake a shadow for an enemy. Your journey is moving from the battlefield to the throne room. You have learned why you must not fight. You have seen the futility of the sword, but there remains a question of when. For the mind is a clock, and there is a precise moment when a thought turns into a belief, a moment when a seed becomes a root. To govern your kingdom, you must understand the timing of the soul. You must become more than a warrior. You must become a guardian of the seconds. Prepare to enter the watchtower. Our next movement begins with the sentry at the gate. In the silent laboratory of the soul, there exists a device more precise than any Swiss chronometer and more ancient than the stars. It is the water clock of intent. Here, time does not pass in hours or days, but in the rhythmic, crystalline drip of individual moments. Each drop represents a choice. Each splash is a manifestation in embryo. The master architect stands before this clock, observing the surface of a perfectly still pool of consciousness. Suddenly, a disturbance. A single, dark mote falls from the rafters of the subconscious, a thought of doubt. It is small, almost invisible, a microscopic speck of what if it fails. To the untrained eye, it is nothing. But in the physics of this sacred space, the architect knows the terrifying math of the soul, the window of germination. If that mote is allowed to sit upon the surface of the pool for more than 30 heartbeats, a transformation occurs. At 5 seconds, it is a mere intruder. At 15, it begins to dissolve, its ink-black dye bleeding into the clear water of the wish fulfilled. By the 30th second, the mote is no longer an external object. It has been absorbed. It has become a part of the water. To remove it now would require a violent filtration, a painful distillation of the entire vessel. The paradox of the master is found here. The most profound spiritual transformations are not won through decades of meditation, but through the savage protection of 30-second windows. The seeker waits for a great moment to prove their faith, while the sentry knows that the only moment that matters is the one currently ticking. We believe we are building a life, but we are actually only ever managing a half minute. If you can govern 30 seconds, you can govern an empire. If you lose those 30 seconds, the empire is already lost, though the news of its fall may take years to reach the outskirts. To master the sentry's craft, one must apply the recursive thinking method to the anatomy of the rule itself. We must ask why until we reach the biological and metaphysical bedrock of the mind. Why 30 seconds? Why not an hour? Why not a single second? The answer lies in the way consciousness interacts with the radio dial of the nervous system. A thought is a fleeting electrical impulse. It is the shadow cast by a passing bird. It has no mass. However, when the mind grants a thought sustained attention, the body begins to produce the chemical equivalent of that thought. At approximately the 30-second mark, the brain completes a circuit. It moves from a cognitive observation to a felt experience. Once the body feels the doubt, the shadow has acquired a body. By keeping the redirection within 30 seconds, we prevent the thought from hijacking the endocrine system. We stop the doubt from becoming a feeling, and feelings are the anchors that hold us in the not having. How is the rule structured? The rule is a three-phased movement of passive sovereignty. The 5-second catch, observation. This is the naming. Why must we name it? Because to name a thing is to prove you are separate from it. When you say, there is doubt, you are the observer, not the victim. You are looking at the mirror, noticing a smudge, but you are not the smudge itself. The disinterested dismissal, the refusal, this is the cutting of the cable. We use a phrase of indifference because anger or fear is a form of feeding. If you scream at the echo, the canyon only screams back louder. A disinterested, not my reality, is the metaphysical equivalent of turning the radio dial away from static. It denies the static, the one thing it needs to survive, your resonance. The 2-5-second return, the re-entry. Why 25 seconds for the return? Because the vacuum created by the dismissal must be filled immediately. If you clear the shadow but leave the room empty, the shadow will simply return with its 7 brothers. You must use the remaining time to flood the consciousness with the wish fulfilled. You must make the assumption so heavy, so vivid, and so emotionally real that it displaces the memory of the doubt. The recursive why of the return. Why must the return be emotional? Because the law of manifestation is the law of feeling state. If you spend 25 seconds merely thinking about your desire, you are still standing outside of it. You must inhabit it. You must feel the relief, the gratitude, and the solidity of the already done. You are not praying for the rain, you are feeling the mud between your toes. You are not looking at the wish in the mirror. You are being the person the mirror is forced to reflect. In the high mountain kingdom of Athelgard, there lived a woman named Elara, the royal weaver. Her task was to weave the tapestry of the king's reign, a massive, shimmering fabric made of silk and light that supposedly determined the prosperity of the land. The loom was a monstrous engine of silver and wood, and the golden thread was so fine it was almost invisible. Ilara knew a secret passed down through generations of weavers. The tapestry was not a record of what had happened, but a blueprint of what would happen. If she wove with a steady hand and a heart fixed on the king's greatness, the harvests were bountiful. If her hand wavered, the winds grew cold. One morning as the sun touched the loom, a gray thread, the thread of doubt, appeared in her basket. It was a dull, coarse fiber that whispered of drought and rebellion. Ilara felt a prickle of fear. She looked at the gray thread and thought, what if this belongs in the pattern? What if I cannot stop it? For 20 seconds, she stared at the gray thread. She began to analyze its texture. She wondered where it came from. She debated whether she should weave it into a corner of the tapestry just to be safe. As she focused on it, the golden thread on the loom began to fray. The very air in the weaving room grew heavy and dim. The shadow of the gray thread was beginning to consume the light of her work. At the 25th second, Ilara remembered the vow of the century. She did not grab a pair of shears to fight the gray thread. She did not cry out in protest. With a calm, almost bored expression, she looked away. She whispered, "That is not the king's pattern," and she reached instead for the most vibrant, radiant golden thread in her collection. For the next 25 seconds, she threw the shuttle with a deliberate rhythmic intensity. She felt the silk beneath her fingers. She visualized the golden fields of wheat and the singing of the people. She poured her entire being into the assumption of the masterpiece. When she looked back at the basket, the gray thread was gone. It had not been stolen or hidden. It had simply ceased to be because the weaver's attention had been withdrawn. The golden thread on the loom was now thicker and more brilliant than before. The window of germination had been closed. Ilara had not defeated the gray thread. She had simply refused to give it the 30 seconds it required to become a part of the world's history. The loom of Ilara is the mind of every human being. Your tapestry is being woven in every moment, and the gray threads of doubt will always appear in the basket. They are a natural part of the creative process, the static on the radio dial. Your mistake has been believing that because a thread is in the basket, it must be in the weave. To embody the truth of the century, you must treat your day as a series of 30-second checkpoints. Do not worry about staying in the state for 24 hours. That is an impossible burden that leads to the futility of the sword. Instead, simply commit to the watchtower. The practical sentry training. The mental stopwatch. Carry an invisible stopwatch in your mind. The moment you feel the flicker of doubt, the gray thread, press start. The 5-second identification. Before the timer hits 05, say internally, doubt is attempting to land. This is the naming. The disinterested dismissal. At 06, pivot. Do not argue. Do not explain. Use your phrase, "not my reality." Turn the radio dial with a flick of the wrist. The 2-5-second saturation. From 06 to 030, do not think about your wish. Think from it. If you desire wealth, feel the weight of your wallet. If you desire health, feel the strength in your lungs. Inhabit the wish fulfilled until the timer hits 30 seconds. This practice is the difference between a life of reaction and a life of creation. You are no longer a victim of the gray threads. You are the master weaver. If this blueprint for sovereignty has provided the clarity you seek, signify your commitment to the craft by liking and subscribing. We are building a library of the unseen, and your presence is a vital thread in the weave. You have learned the anatomy of the 30 seconds. You have seen the loom. But why is it that some seeds seem to grow even when we think we are watching? Why do we wake up in the morning with a forest of doubt already grown, as if a thief planted them in the night? To answer this, we must look deeper into the nature of the soil itself. We must understand how the very things we ignore can take root if we leave even a single door unlatched. Prepare to enter the garden of the subconscious. Our next movement reveals the germination of shadows. The twilight of the subconscious is a fertile, humid expanse, a vast, black loam garden where time behaves with a terrifying, elastic fluidly. In this silent sanctuary, there are no idle thoughts, there are only seeds. To the uninitiated, a thought is a fleeting ghost, a wisp of vapor that vanishes as quickly as it appears. But to the master content architect, a thought is a biological mandate. Imagine a vast, sun-bleached plaza of white marble stretching toward an infinite horizon. This is the mind in its primal state of assumption. It is solid, unyielding, and radiant. Now, imagine a single dark seed falling from the sky. If that seed lands upon the marble, it remains a mere curiosity, a speck of dust that the wind of a single breath can sweep away. It has no purchase. It cannot feed. It is a doubt that has met the 3-0 second rule. It has fallen on concrete. But now, observe the shift. Imagine the marble begins to soften, turning into rich, damp earth the longer you stare at the seed. This is the soil of sustained attention. If the observer pauses to wonder why the seed is dark, or where it came from, or what might happen if it were to grow, the marble dissolves. The humidity of anxiety rises. The warmth of emotional engagement provides the catalyst. Within 30 seconds of uncontested focus, the seed's casing cracks. Microscopic tendrils, thinner than silk but stronger than steel, lash out to grip the earth. The paradox is chilling. Doubt is not a force of nature. It is a creature that requires you to provide its environment. It is a parasite that cannot breathe unless you give it your lungs. We wonder why we wake up in the morning paralyzed by fear, as if a forest of thorns grew overnight. We scream at the sky, asking how such a nightmare could have manifested so quickly. We fail to see the truth. The forest did not arrive unbidden. It was invited by the 30 seconds we spent the previous afternoon examining a single what if. We didn't just look at the seed, we became the soil. Why is the window of 30 seconds the precise boundary between a passing thought and a permanent reality? To answer this, we must apply the recursive thinking method to the very biology of belief. Why does a thought require a window of time to become real? Because consciousness is a slow-setting cement. A thought, in its initial state, is merely an electrical pulse, a shadow passing over the mirror of the mind. It has no weight. However, the human nervous system is designed to seek proof through consistency. When you give a thought 30 seconds of uncontested attention, you are signaling to your biology that this thought is a priority. You are turning the radio dial and holding it there until the signal is locked. How does this attention transform the shadow into a solid? At the 5-second mark, the brain recognizes the thought. At 15 seconds, the endocrine system begins to respond, releasing microdoses of cortisol or adrenaline if the thought is one of doubt. By 30 seconds, a neurological loop is formed. The body now feels what the mind is thinking. This is the germination. Once the body feels the doubt, it enters a state of not having. The echo of the fear begins to resonate in the bones. Recursive question. Why is the body's involvement the point of no return? Because the body is the subconscious mind. While the conscious mind can entertain two opposing thoughts, the house divided, the body can only inhabit one state at a time. If the body feels the tension of doubt, it has accepted the doubt as truth. The seed has hit the soil. From this point forward, you are no longer observing a thought. You are living an experience. Recursive question. How does not feeding the doubt actually kill it? Doubt is a purely entropic force. It has no self-sustaining energy. In the realm of the mirror, if the subject stops moving, the reflection must stop moving. If you withdraw the moisture of your interest and the heat of your anxiety, the seed remains dormant. It withers on the concrete. The 3-0 second rule is not a psychological trick. It is a nutritional strategy. You are starving a monster before it has the strength to bite. You are refusing to provide the one thing the shadow needs to cast a darkness, your light. In the chronicles of the celestial heights, there once stood the silver city of Ethelgard. Its walls were not made of stone, but of a substance called luminance, a solidified form of the citizens' collective certainty. As long as the people believed in the city's invincibility, the walls were harder than diamond and brighter than the sun. The architect of Ethelgard, a man named Valerius, understood the law of the seed. He knew that the city was surrounded by the grey wilds, a wasteland of shifting mists where the ivy of discord grew. This ivy was not a plant of the earth, it was a plant of the mind. It fed on lingering looks. One afternoon, a young sentry named Kale stood upon the ramparts. He noticed a single tiny sprout of the grey ivy appearing in a crack at the base of the wall. It was no larger than a needle. Kale knew the law. Look away and return to the light. But Kale was curious. He thought, how could such a small thing threaten a city of light? What is its secret? He looked at the ivy for 10 seconds. The sprout thickened, turning a deep bruised purple. He looked for 20 seconds. He began to wonder if the wall was truly as strong as Valerius claimed. He felt a cold shiver in his chest, the moisture of doubt. By the 30th second, the ivy had already sent a root deep into the luminance of the wall. Suddenly, the wall beneath Cale's feet softened. It was no longer diamond. It was becoming soil. The ivy began to climb with a supernatural speed, its tendrils wrapping around the spires, its leaves blocking out the sun. By sunset, the Silver City was a ruin of green shadows. The citizens wept, crying out that a great enemy had invaded. But Valerius, standing in the center of the square, knew there was no enemy. He saw the truth. Cale had provided the soil. The ivy didn't have the power to break the wall. It only had the power to grow where the light was withdrawn. The city fell not because the ivy was strong, but because the sentry gave it 30 uncontested seconds of his life force. Valerius gathered the survivors and gave them a single instruction. Do not fight the ivy, do not cut it, do not study it. Look at the center of the square, where the foundation stone remains, and assume the city is already restored. Give the ivy 0 seconds of your gaze. For 3 days, the people refused to acknowledge the green shadows. They lived in the assumption of the Silver City. On the 4th day, the ivy, denied the heat of their fear and the soil of their attention, simply turned to ash and blew away in the wind. The walls returned to diamond, not because they were rebuilt, but because the soil had been turned back into luminance. The tragedy of Cale is the tragedy of every student of the law who fails to manifest. We spend our nights in the Silver City of our meditations, feeling the reality of our desires. But the moment we step out into the gray wilds of the physical world and see a gray sprout, a bill we cannot pay, a coldness in a partner, a symptom in the body, we stop to examine it. We give it 30 seconds of our life force, and in that window, we turn the diamond of our faith into the soil of our despair. To embody this truth today, you must realize that you are the alchemist of the internal landscape. Your attention is the chemical agent that determines whether your mind is concrete or soil. The practical discipline of the soil. The recognition of purchase. Throughout the day, ask yourself, am I providing a landing strip for shadows? If a doubt appears, visualize your mind as the white marble plaza. The doubt is a seed on stone. It has no roots. The 3-0, second de-escalation. If you find yourself looking at the ivy, analyzing the doubt, you must break the gaze immediately. Do not finish the thought. Even if the thought feels reasonable or logical, it is a seed. The flooding of the plaza. Use the remaining time to blast the seed away with the light of your assumption. Feel the solidity of the marble. Feel the luminance of the wish fulfilled. You are the guardian of the window. Every 30 seconds you reclaim is a brick in the wall of your inevitable success. If you are beginning to see the ivy for what it is, a powerless parasite, then you are ready to master the next phase of the craft. Like and subscribe to continue your apprenticeship in the architecture of the soul. But beware, the mind is a creature of ancient habits. When you stop feeding the doubt, it will not go quietly. It will attempt to bring you into its own territory. It will summon you to a place where it feels powerful, a place of judgment and evidence. It will call you to the stand. It will demand that you defend your delusion against the facts. Prepare your defense, but not with words. Our next movement takes us into the center of the mental storm, the courtroom of the mind. The moon hung like a silver coin over a sanctuary of absolute serenity. Below, in a garden of her own making, a woman sat in the posture of a saint. The scent of night-blooming jasmine rose to meet her, and her breath was a rhythmic tide that seemed to pull the very stars closer. In this sacred silence, she was a master. She inhabited a reality where love was a tangible warmth, and her desires were already blossoming into form. She wore the wish fulfilled like a robe of finest silk. This was her nightly ritual, a disciplined, vivid, and fully inhabited immersion into the state of her choosing. For these few moments, the mirror of her mind reflected only the divine. But as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, a transformative horror took place. The jasmine vanished, replaced by the sterile, acrid scent of old parchment and cold stone. The garden dissolved into a windowless, subterranean chamber, the internal courtroom. By the light of day, this same woman, this faithful student of the law, donned the black robes of both prosecutor and defense attorney. She stood before the high bench of her own judgment, surrounded by the heavy, leather-bound ledgers of physical evidence. The silence of the garden was replaced by the deafening clamor of a trial that never ended. "Where is the proof?" the prosecutor barked, pointing a trembling finger at the empty space beside her. "Why does the bank account still show a deficit? Why hasn't he called? Look at the evidence of the clock. Look at the evidence of the world." With a heart heavy as lead, she would scramble to the defense. "It is coming," she would shout, stacking affirmations like sandbags against a rising tide. "I have done the work. I have felt the state. The law must respond." She was not lazy. She was the most disciplined prisoner in the history of the mind. She spent 2 minutes in the Garden of Heaven and 22 hours in the courtroom of hell. She was a master of the ritual, yet a slave to the result. The paradox was a jagged glass in the throat of her soul. How could a mind so devoted to the truth of having spent its entire day obsessing over the lack? She was attempting to manifest a kingdom while spending her every waking hour proving to herself that she was still a pauper. Scene 3. Deep deconstruction. To understand the tragedy of the disciplined skeptic, we must apply the recursive thinking method to the architecture of this internal litigation. We must ask, why, until the gavel of the ego shatters upon the stone? Why does the seeker fail despite perfect technique? The failure is not one of technique, but of dominance. Consciousness is a democratic landscape governed by a single, unyielding law. The heavier assumption wins by default. We must look at the ratio. If a man spends 10 minutes imagining he is a lion and the remaining 14 hours convinced he is a mouse, the universe does not see a lion in progress. It sees a mouse with a brief, imaginative hobby. The state is not what you visit during a meditation. It is where you live when you are not looking. How does the internal courtroom sustain the not having? The courtroom functions through the mechanism of the echo. When the seeker enters the courtroom to argue with doubt, they believe they are defending their faith. But in the metaphysics of the mind, the argument is the doubt. Consider the radio dial. The wish fulfilled is a symphony playing on a high-frequency station. Doubt is the static on a lower band. When you hear the static, you do not fight the static by screaming at the radio. If you spend your day constructing counter-arguments against the static, you have simply spent your day listening to static and calling it defense. You are still tuned to the frequency of lack. The how of the failure is found in the engagement. The moment you cross-examine a doubt, you have granted it a seat at the table. You have validated that its presence is a problem to be solved, rather than a non-event to be ignored. Why is the defense as toxic as the prosecution? This is the recursive trap. The defense attorney in your mind, the one shouting affirmations to drown out the fear, is actually the loudest witness for the prosecution. You do not build a fortress against a shadow that has no power. You do not argue with a lie that you know to be false. The very act of trying to convince yourself is a subconscious confession that you are not yet convinced. It is an acknowledgement that the shadow has enough substance to require a battle. If you find yourself exhausted by the trial, it is because you are trying to win a case that shouldn't be heard. The only way to win the argument is to leave the courtroom. If this clarity is beginning to dismantle the walls of your internal prison, take this moment to like and subscribe. Align your attention with the frequency of sovereignty, not litigation. The why of our stagnation is simple. We treat our desires as a project to be managed rather than a reality to be inhabited. We spend our days waiting for the mirror to change so we can stop arguing, forgetting that the mirror only records the argument. In the ancient city of Oros, there lived an architect named Julian, who had been commissioned by a distant king to build a cathedral of light. The king had given Julian the blueprints, the funding, and the absolute promise that the materials were already in transit. Julian was a man of immense discipline. Every morning for 1 hour, he would stand in the empty lot and visualize the cathedral in its finished glory. He would see the stained glass catching the morning sun. He would feel the cool marble of the altar. He would lose himself in the reality of the finished work. But the moment he stepped away from the lot, Julian entered his office of investigation. He spent the rest of the day pacing the floor, staring at the empty horizon. He would call the stonemasons every hour to ask why the trucks hadn't arrived. He would write frantic letters to the king, begging for a sign that the promise was still valid. He would argue with the city skeptics, presenting his blueprints as proof that he wasn't a fool. "The cathedral is real," he would scream at the empty street. "I have seen it in my mind. I have felt the marble." But his neighbors only saw a man standing in the dirt, shouting at shadows. One day, a master builder visited Julian. He watched the architect spend 10 minutes in vision and 10 hours in worry. Julian, the master builder, said, "Why do you spend your days proving that the cathedral isn't here?" "I'm not," Julian protested. "I'm defending the king's promise. I'm fighting the doubt of the city." The master builder shook his head. "Every time you call the masons to ask where, you are assuming not here. Every time you argue with a skeptic, you are admitting that the skeptic's empty lot is more real to you than the king's cathedral. You are a man with two blueprints. One is made of light and lasts for an hour. The other is made of dirt and lasts for the day. Which one do you think the earth will follow?" Julian realized that his defense of the king's promise was the very thing delaying the stone. He was so busy being the architect of the struggle that he had no room to be the architect of the possession. He had made the absence of the cathedral the most important topic of his life. The tragedy of Julian is the tragedy of the seeker who spends 22 hours in the courtroom. The solution is not to fight better, it is to declare a mistrial. To embody this today, you must recognize that your internal courtroom only has power because you continue to show up for the hearings. You are the judge, the jury, the prosecutor, and the defendant. You are the one who keeps the lights on in that subterranean chamber. The practical integration of the sovereignty. Identify the gavel. Throughout the day, catch yourself in the act of convincing yourself. Notice when you are searching for proof, checking for signs, or building a case against your doubt. Declare a mistrial. The moment you feel the litigation starting, apply the 3-0 rule. Do not answer the prosecutor's question. Do not present your evidence. Simply say, "The court is adjourned. I do not live in this jurisdiction." Return to the garden. Use the remaining 25 seconds to return to the state where the desire is a settled fact. Not a maybe, not a coming soon, but a done. In the garden of the wish fulfilled, there are no questions. There is only the presence. The law does not respond to your effort. It responds to your consistency. It does not care how hard you fight. It only cares where you dwell. If you are ready to vacate the courtroom forever, like and subscribe to cement this new law in your consciousness. We are moving from the struggle of the becoming to the peace of the being. You have learned why the courtroom is a trap. You have seen how the defense feeds the shadow. But even as you walk out of those stone walls, you will face a new challenge. The old world, the one built on the 2-2-hour cycle of doubt, will not vanish instantly. It will demand a trial of a different kind. It will demand a training. To make this shift permanent, we must move from the courtroom to the barracks. We must build the muscle of attention until it is stronger than the gravity of the past. The path ahead is narrow, but the destination is inevitable. Prepare for the transformation of your perception. Our next movement begins with the 7-day siege. The forest was a cathedral of ancient, suffocating density, where the canopy was woven so tightly that the sun appeared only as a memory. Beneath the towering oaks of habit, there lay a path, a deep, jagged rut in the earth, carved by the iron-shod wheels of 1,000 years of doubt. This was the low road, the path of least resistance. To walk it required no effort. The very gravity of the landscape pulled the traveler into its familiar muddy depths. Every footstep taken here was an echo of 1 billion previous steps, a rhythmic confirmation that the lack was the only landscape that truly existed. Standing at the edge of this rut was the seeker, eyes fixed upon a new horizon, a ridge of pure, crystalline light where the wish fulfilled resided. To reach it, the seeker had to do more than dream. They had to perform a pattern interruption of geological proportions. They had to step out of the rut and onto the virgin soil of the new assumption. The first step was a revelation of friction. The briars of the past, thorny, sentient vines of what if, lashed out to snag the hem of the seeker's robe. The air itself seemed to thicken, vibrating with the low-frequency hum of a radio dial stuck between stations. The paradox of the journey was this: the path to the light was not blocked by a wall, but by the sheer, crushing weight of the old way. The mind, like a river that had carved a canyon, did not want to flow uphill. It screamed that the new direction was a delusion, a phantom, a betrayal of the solid ground of the rut. Yet, as the seeker persisted, a subtle magic began to unfold. Every time a thorn was ignored, every time the foot was planted firmly upon the new soil, the briars seemed to lose their color. The shadows cast by the ancient oaks flickered. This was not a battle of strength, but a siege of consistency. The seeker was not trying to destroy the forest. They were simply refusing to walk the old path for 7 consecutive sunrises. They were building a new neural highway, one heartbeat at a time, proving that the most formidable fortress in the world, the human ego, could be dismantled by the quiet, repetitive act of choosing a different direction. Why 7 days? Why must the sentry remain at the watchtower for this specific cycle of time? To understand the 7-day siege, we must apply the recursive thinking method to the very architecture of the human nervous system. We must ask, why until we reach the subterranean gears of the subconscious? Why does the initial shift feel like an act of violence against the self? Because the brain is an organ of efficiency, not truth. It builds neural grooves, physical pathways of least resistance. For decades, you have fed the radio dial of your consciousness with the frequency of not having. This has created a heavier assumption that acts like a gravitational well. When you attempt to choose the wish fulfilled, you are literally trying to rewire the biological hardware of your skull. The friction you feel is not a sign of failure. It is the sound of the old machinery protesting its own obsolescence. How does the doubt hunter survive the first 3 days? The first 72 hours of the siege are the most perilous, for this is when the echo of the old life is loudest. The mind, sensing its dominant patterns are under threat, will summon reasonable doubts like a besieged king summoning his final reserves. It will point to the mirror of your bank account or your lonely room and scream, "Look at the evidence." The hunter survives by realizing that the mirror is a lagging indicator. It is showing you the light of stars that died 1,000,000 years ago. To doubt hunt is to recognize that the 5-second catch is not a psychological trick, but a biological intervention. By naming the doubt within 5 seconds, you are preventing the brain from locking the circuit. You are refusing to let the electrical pulse of fear become a chemical bath of cortisol. You are keeping the seed on the concrete, denying it the moisture of your emotional engagement. Why does day 7 represent the great shift? By the 7th day of consistent redirection, a phenomenon known as synaptic pruning begins to take effect. In the absence of attention, the old neural pathways, those jagged ruts in the forest, begin to wither. They are like a radio dial that has been left untuned for so long that the static loses its volume. Simultaneously, the new pathway of assumption begins to myelinate. It becomes coated in a fatty sheath that makes the signal faster and more automatic. Recursive question. Why is the internal tally necessary? Because awareness is the precursor to sovereignty. Most people believe they have tried the law, but they have only ever flirted with it. They spend 5 minutes in the state and 23 hours in the courtroom. The tally forces the mind to witness its own infidelity. It transforms the seeker from a passive victim of thoughts into an active governor of the seconds. It proves that doubt is not a monster, but a habit, and habits are the only things in the universe that can be starved to death. On a jagged, wind-swept island at the edge of the known world, there stood a lighthouse known as the Sovereign's Eye. For generations, the lighthouse was plagued by a curse of smoke. No matter how pure the oil or how bright the flame, the great glass lenses were constantly blackened by a thick, greasy soot that seemed to appear out of thin air. The ships of the kingdom were frequently wrecked upon the rocks, for the light was always eclipsed by the shadow of the smoke. A new keeper arrived, a woman named Ilara. The previous keepers told her stories of the smoke spirits that lived in the chimney, monsters that had to be fought with prayers and complex incantations. They spent their days scrubbing the glass with frantic energy, only to see the soot return the moment they turned their backs. Ilara did something different. She didn't fight the smoke. She didn't study the soot. Instead, she spent the first day simply watching the glass. She noticed that the smoke only appeared when she allowed her mind to wander toward the fear of the wreck. The moment she imagined a ship hitting the rocks, a puff of soot would hit the lens. The smoke was not a spirit. It was a physical manifestation of her own wavering attention. She declared a 7-day siege upon her own perception. Her rule was simple. The light must be the only reality. On day 1, the smoke was relentless. Every 5 seconds, a thought of, "What if the light fails?" would cause a smear of black on the glass. Ilara would catch it instantly. She would say, "That is the smoke, not the signal," and she would return her focus to the brilliant white core of the flame. She polished the glass not with effort, but with the indifference of her gaze. By day 3, the smoke had changed. It was no longer thick and greasy, it was thin, like a fading mist. The shadow was losing its grip. Ilara found that she no longer had to scrub. A single disinterested glance was enough to keep the glass clear. On day 7, a miracle occurred. A massive storm rolled in the grand doubt of the ocean. The waves were mountains of black water, and the wind screamed like 1,000 banshees. The old keepers would have been paralyzed, certain the smoke would bury the light. But Ilara stood in the gallery, her heart anchored in the certainty of the flame. She refused to give the storm even 30 seconds of her concern. As the ships approached, the light from the sovereign's eye didn't just shine, it pierced the storm like a sword of God. There was no smoke. The glass remained as clear as diamond, for there was no longer a soil of fear for the soot to land upon. The ships were guided home, not because the storm had ended, but because the keeper had mastered the architecture of attention. She had proven that the light is always there. It is only our engagement with the smoke that makes us blind. The story of Ilara is the blueprint for your 7-day siege. You are the keeper of the light, and your smoke is the doubt that seeks to blacken the lens of your assumption. You have spent years scrubbing the glass of your life, trying to fix the smoke of your circumstances, never realizing that the smoke is fueled by the very attention you give it. To embody this truth today, you must begin your own tactical training. This is not a week of positive thinking, it is a week of sovereign selection. The 7-day tactical protocol. Choose one desire. Select one specific assumption you wish to harden into fact. This is your signal fire. The Doubt Hunter's Tally. Keep a small notebook or a mental tally. Every time a smoke thread, doubt, appears, catch it within 5 seconds. Dismiss it. Return to the flame. The 3-0. Second mandate. Do not allow a single doubt to uncontestedly occupy your mind for more than 30 seconds. If you fail, do not judge. Simply reset the clock and begin again. Observe the shift. Note the transition on day 3. Notice how the shadow feels thinner. Notice how the radio dial begins to stay tuned to the music of your desire without your constant intervention. Your consciousness is the most valuable territory in existence. The siege is how you reclaim it from the squatters of fear. If you have felt the first spark of this new power, signify your entry into the watchtower by liking and subscribing. We are building a collective of sovereign minds, and your victory is our signal fire. You have learned the discipline of the siege. You have seen the keeper at the glass. But as the smoke clears and the light grows steady, you will discover a final, staggering truth. You will realize that doubt was never an enemy to be defeated, nor a curse to be lifted. You will see that doubt and faith are made of the same substance, flowing through the same channel, governed by the same hand. The war is over, and the alchemy begins. Prepare for the ultimate reframe. Our next movement reveals the alchemist's reframe. Deep within the subterranean archives of the Great Hermetic Library, where the air tasted of ozone and ancient sulfur, an old alchemist sat before a twin flame furnace. On the left side of the crucible, a stream of molten lead flowed, dull and heavy, absorbing the light around it until the room felt dim and oppressive. On the right, a stream of liquid gold surged, radiant and defiant, casting long, triumphant shadows against the stone walls. To the uninitiated observer, these were two warring substances, one, the symbol of the earth's burden, the other, the emblem of heaven's glory. But the alchemist did not see a conflict. He did not see two different metals engaged in a struggle for dominance. He reached into the very heart of the furnace with a gloved hand and pulled back the veil of the flickering heat. "Look closer," the master content architect whispered through the silence of the prose. The paradox was revealed in the microscopic dance of the atoms. At their core, the lead and the gold were composed of the exact same light, the same vibrating essence, the same primal fire. The only difference lay in the direction of their spin, the arrangement of their internal geometry. The lead was not evil, and the gold was not virtuous. They were simply the same power, expressed through two different blueprints of intent. This is the staggering truth that marks the end of the spiritual war. Doubt and faith are not opposites. They are not two different forces battling for the soul of the seeker. They are the same creative engine, the same misplaced creative power, flowing through the same channel of consciousness. We have spent our lives trying to kill the lead to find the gold, never realizing that the lead is the gold, currently masquerading in a state of contraction. We have feared doubt as a demon, when it was merely faith pointed at the wrong horizon. To understand this is to move from the exhaustion of the warrior to the effortless mastery of the alchemist. To master the alchemist reframe, we must apply the recursive thinking method to the anatomy of belief itself. We must peel back the labels of fear and certainty until we reach the raw, undifferentiated energy that fuels them both. Why do we perceive doubt and faith as enemies? We perceive them as enemies because we are focused on the result rather than the process. When we look at the mirror of our lives and see a deficit, we call the energy that created it doubt. When we see abundance, we call the energy faith. However, the mirror is indifferent to the labels. It only records the intensity of the focus. How is doubt a creative act? This is the recursive breakthrough. Consider the radio dial. To doubt is to perform a feat of immense imaginative labor. To doubt is to visualize with exquisite detail and emotional charge exactly what you do not want. It is to inhabit the state of not having so fully that your body responds with the chemical equivalent of lack. You are using the exact same faculty of the wish fulfilled, the same vividness, the same persistence, the same conviction, but you are aiming it at the shadow instead of the light. Doubt is not the absence of power, it is the presence of power misdirected. Why is this realization the key to sovereignty? If doubt were a separate entity, a demon, or a flaw, you would be required to perform an exorcism. You would be trapped in the futility of the sword, trying to slay a part of your own nature. But if doubt is simply misplaced creative power, then the solution is not destruction but redirection. Recursive question: how does the energy move? The energy moves through the shunt. Imagine a massive river. You do not stop the river to change its course. You build a new channel. You realize that the fear you feel is actually excitement with a different narrative. The anxiety is anticipation aimed at a catastrophe. When you apply the 3-0 second rule from this perspective, you are not fighting the doubt. You are simply stepping into the flow of the current and gently turning the rudder. You are saying, I see this immense power I am currently using to create a nightmare. I shall now take that same intensity and aim it at my dream. Recursive question: why is the 3-0 second window the alchemical crucible? Because 30 seconds is the time it takes for the spin of the atoms to stabilize. If you catch the lead, doubt, within the first 5 seconds and realize it is made of gold, creative power, you can prevent it from hardening into a physical circumstance. You are not overcoming the doubt. You are transmuting it. You are acknowledging the weight of the thought and deciding with the indifference of a master that this weight shall now serve the assumption of your greatness. In the age of the great navigators, there was a captain named Silas who commanded a ship called the Alchemist. Silas was known for a feat that defied the laws of the sea. He could sail his ship directly into the teeth of a gale and arrive at his destination faster than those who had the wind at their backs. One afternoon, a massive storm, the grand doubt of the Atlantic, descended upon the fleet. The other captains did what they had been trained to do. They feared the wind. They viewed the storm as an enemy. They furled their sails, dropped their anchors, and entered a state of desperate defense. They fought the storm, and in their fighting, the storm broke their masts and shredded their hulls. They were paralyzed by the weight of the atmosphere. Silas, however, stood on the quarterdeck of the Alchemist. He did not curse the wind. He did not pray for the storm to end. He looked at the screaming gale and saw not a threat, but an immense reservoir of unused velocity. "Captain," his mate shouted, "we must batten down. The wind is against us." "The wind is not against us, Thorn," Silas replied, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. "The wind is simply moving. It is our sails that determine the direction, not the air." Silas ordered the crew to perform the alchemist's maneuver. He didn't pull the sails in, he angled them with surgical precision. He used the very pressure of the gale, the doubt, to create a vacuum on the opposite side of the canvas. By shunting the energy of the storm, he forced the wind to push the ship forward, even as it tried to blow it back. The ship groaned. The tension was immense. For 30 seconds it seemed as though the alchemist would be ripped apart by the opposing forces. This was the crucible of the shift. But Silas held the rudder steady. He remained indifferent to the noise of the wind, focused entirely on the navigational assumption of the harbor. Suddenly, the ship leaped forward. The alchemist began to plane across the water at a speed no one had ever witnessed. The storm was still raging, the clouds were still black, but Silas was using the shadow to reach the light. He was the only one moving because he was the only one who realized that the storm and the trade wind were the same air, merely arriving from a different coordinate. He arrived at the Isles of Gold while the warriors were still mending their broken blades in the gray mist of the starting line. The captain's secret is the ultimate liberation for the seeker. You do not need more faith. You already possess infinite creative power. You have simply been using it to manifest the very things you fear. You have been a master of doubt manifestation, creating lack with the same precision that a god creates a galaxy. To embody this truth today, you must stop being the enemy of your doubt and start being the alchemist of your energy. The practical alchemical protocol. The energy audit. The next time a wave of doubt hits you, the gale of fear, stop. Do not fight it. Feel the raw power of the emotion. Notice the intensity, the vividness of the mental imagery, and the weight of the conviction. The reframe of the substance. Say to yourself, this is my creative power. This is the same energy I use for faith, currently pointed at a shadow. I thank the doubt for showing me how much power I actually have. The 3-0. Second shunt. Take that raw, vibrating intensity and, within 30 seconds, angling the sail, redirect that same conviction toward your assumption. If you were sure it would fail, spend 25 seconds being sure it is already done. Use the heat of the anxiety to fuel the fire of the wish fulfilled. You are no longer a victim of your thoughts. You are the director of the light. The lead is turning to gold the moment you refuse to call it lead. If you have felt the heavy anchors of right and wrong thoughts dissolve, signify your mastery of the crucible by liking and subscribing. We are no longer learning to manifest. We are learning to direct the power that is already manifesting everything. You have learned that doubt is not your enemy. You have seen the captain use the storm to reach the shore. But as you master the shunt, you will notice a strange phenomenon. The enemies will stop arriving as warriors and start arriving as guests. They will knock at your door, no longer seeking to destroy, but seeking a home. How do you handle the stranger who arrives with the face of your old fears, but without the power to hurt? The laboratory is quiet, but the doorbell is ringing. Our next movement reveals the stranger at the door. The residence of the soul had become a place of profound, echoing stillness. It was a manor built of solidified light, standing atop a cliff of unwavering certainty. Inside, the master sat by a hearth that burned with the steady blue flame of the wish fulfilled. There was no wind to rattle the shutters, no leak in the roof of the psyche, and no shadows dancing in the corners that were not invited by the master's own design. The radio dial was locked. The symphony of Already Done played with a richness that made the very walls vibrate with satisfaction. Suddenly, through the perfect silence, came a sound that would have once signaled a catastrophe, a knock at the heavy oak door. In the years of the war, this knock would have been a thunderclap of dread. The master would have bolted from the chair, heart hammering against ribs, lunging for the sword of affirmation. They would have shouted through the wood, demanded proof of identity, or spent hours barricaded against the enemy they were certain had come to raze the house to the ground. The knock was the arrival of doubt, and in the old world, the arrival of doubt meant the departure of faith. But now, as the rap-tap-tap echoed through the hallway, the master did not even look up from the book of their own destiny. They did not check the locks. They did not summon the guards of reason. The knock was heard. Yes, for the senses do not die, but it was no longer listened to. It was a sensory event without a psychological consequence. It was a stranger knocking at a door for which they no longer possessed a key. The paradox was a quiet, majestic truth. The ultimate evidence of mastery is not the absence of the knock, but the total indifference of the inhabitant. The enemy had not been slain in some grand bloody battle. It had been demoted. It had transitioned from a resident to a ghost, and finally, to a mere stranger passing in the street. The master realized that the door was not a barrier to be defended, but a boundary that only opened when the master chose to turn the handle. Without the soil of engagement, the stranger at the door was as powerless as a shadow attempting to lift a stone. To reach the end state of the retrained mind, one must undergo a rigorous deconstruction of the relationship between observation and identification. We must apply the recursive thinking method to the transition from the warrior to the indifferent sovereign. Why does doubt stop being a threat in the advanced state? Doubt loses its lethality not because it changes its nature, but because it loses its weight. In the early stages of the craft, every doubt is perceived as a solid, a mountain that must be moved. However, through the consistent application of the 3-0 second rule, the seeker has performed a chemical change in the atmosphere of the mind. By refusing to feed the doubt with the moisture of attention and the heat of anxiety, the doubt has been dehydrated. It has become thin. It is no longer a mountain. It is a shadow cast by a cloud that is already dissipating. How does indifference differ from suppression? This is the most critical recursive distinction. Suppression is a form of secret feeding. When you push a thought down, you are still touching it. You are using your creative power to hold the lead beneath the surface of the water. Because you are engaging with it, the mirror records the struggle, and the law produces more things to be suppressed. Indifference, however, is the act of withdrawing the light. It is the realization that if you do not look at the echo, the canyon eventually runs out of sound. Indifference does not fight the stranger at the door. It simply continues the conversation with the guest of honor, the assumption as if the knock never occurred. Why does the mind eventually rest in the assumption? The brain is a creature of metabolic economy. It will eventually stop firing the neurons of a pattern that yields no reward. When the doubt circuit is triggered but met with a consistent 3-0 second redirection, the brain registers a null result. It is like a radio dial that is turned to a dead frequency. Eventually, the listener stops trying that station altogether. Recursive question. What defines the retrained mind? The retrained mind is one where the wish fulfilled has become the gravitational center. In the past, lack was the natural resting place, and having required an effort of will. Now the roles are reversed. The assumption is the solid ground, and doubt is the stranger who feels out of place. The mind has been myelinated to believe in its own greatness. The mirror no longer shows a seeker trying to find a way. It shows a sovereign who has already arrived and who views the occasional flicker of doubt as nothing more than a passing car in the night seen but never boarded. In the kingdom of Solis, there once ruled a king who was plagued by a wicked jester. This jester was not an ordinary man. He was a master of the poisoned word. He would follow the king into the throne room, the garden, and even to the edge of his bed, whispering of impending coups, of empty treasuries, and of the king's own unworthiness. For many years the king fought the jester. He would argue with him, trying to prove his legitimacy with scrolls and maps. He would throw the jester in the dungeon, only to find the man sitting at the breakfast table the next morning, laughing. The king's entire reign became a response to the jester. The mirror of the kingdom reflected a monarch who was perpetually on the defensive, and thus the kingdom was always in a state of unrest. One day the king visited a blind hermit who lived in a cave of silence. "How do I slay the jester?" the king demanded. "He is the shadow that follows my every step." The hermit smiled. "You cannot slay a man who lives on your breath. Every time you argue with him, you give him your lungs. Every time you imprison him, you give him your walls. The jester does not exist in the world. He exists in your agreement with him." The king returned to the palace. That evening, as he sat down to dine, the jester appeared and whispered, "The grain is rotting in the fields, and your people curse your name." The king did not reach for his sword. He did not call the jester a liar. He simply reached for his wine, tasted the richness of the grape, and turned to his queen to discuss the beauty of the sunset. He gave the jester 0 seconds of his gaze. For 30 seconds the jester screamed, performing his most grotesque dances, his words dripping with the acid of doubt, but the king remained indifferent. He inhabited the state of the beloved ruler so completely that there was no room in his ears for the jests. By the third day, the jester began to shrink. His voice, once a roar, became a thin whistle. He was no longer a wicked jester. He was a stranger in the room, a guest who had stayed too long and realized he was no longer being served. By the 7th day, the king noticed the jester standing in the doorway. The man looked pale and translucent, like a fading echo. He knocked on the doorframe to get the king's attention. The king heard the knock. He saw the man, but he did not invite him in. He did not even acknowledge the interruption. He remained centered in the assumption of his sovereignty. The jester, denied the soil of the king's reaction, simply dissolved into the gray morning mist. He did not die. He simply ceased to be a reality because the king had stopped providing the light that cast his shadow. The king realized that the jester had never had any power of his own. He had only ever had the power the king had loaned him. The silent king is the archetype of the final stage of your training. You have spent chapters learning to hunt the doubt, to siege it, and to transmute it. But now, you must learn the highest art, the art of non-recognition. The stranger at the door is the residue of your old world, a lingering frequency on the radio dial. It will arrive, and it will knock. It will use the face of your old fears and the voice of your old logic. Your task is no longer to fight or fix. Your task is to remain the host of the assumption. The final 3-0, second refinement. The sound of the knock. When a doubt arrives, do not pretend you didn't hear it. Acknowledge the sensory event. There is a knock at the door. This is the 5, second naming. The sovereignty of the chair. Do not stand up. Do not move toward the door. Do not engage in the what if. Remain seated in the feeling of the wish fulfilled. The indifferent transition. Within the remaining 25 seconds, deepen your immersion in your current reality. If the stranger says, "You are poor," do not argue. Simply feel the weight of your abundance. Let the stranger knock until they realize that the master of this house is no longer available for that conversation. You are reaching the shoreline of a new world. The stranger is becoming a ghost, and the assumption is becoming your skin. If you can hear the knock without losing your peace, you have passed the final initiation. Signify your arrival at the gates of the inevitable by liking and subscribing. We are moving beyond the technique and into the being. You have mastered the 30 seconds. You have silenced the jester. You have let the stranger walk past your door without turning the handle. You are now a unified consciousness, a house no longer divided, a ship with its anchors gone and its sails set to the eternal sun. There is only one thing left: to witness the horizon where the internal state and the external world become one indistinguishable flame. The sun is rising and the distance is vanishing. Prepare for the final revelation. Our journey concludes with the inevitable horizon. The world stood at the brink of a nameless dawn, a moment where the horizon ceased to be a dividing line and became a seamless fusion of gold and glass. Here, at the summit of the great work, the sea did not merely reflect the sky, it had become the sky. The master content architect stood upon the shore of the already done, observing a phenomenon that defied the logic of the struggling mind, the paradox of the effortless sunrise. The sun does not try to rise. It does not battle the shadows of the night, nor does it argue with the lingering cold of the stars. It simply is the light, and by virtue of its consistent presence, the darkness is not defeated, it is rendered impossible. In this cinematic stillness, the shadow has been reabsorbed into the body of the light. The echo has returned to the source of the voice, and the mirror has vanished. For when the subject and the reflection are in perfect, unmoving alignment, the glass itself becomes invisible. The seeker has reached the state of the infallible resting place, where the radio dial is no longer a tool to be manipulated, but has become a fixed point, broadcasted by the very marrow of the bones. The inciting observation of the final mastery is this: manifestation is not a project to be completed, but a state of being to be sustained. We have spent our lives looking for the click of the lock, the sign of the arrival, or the proof of the law. Yet, at the horizon of the inevitable, one realizes that the proof was never found in the external world. It was found in the 30-second silence, where doubt was denied its root. The ultimate truth is a majestic, terrifying simplicity. The law does not respond to your desire, your worthiness, or your effort. It responds only to the consistency of your being. To be in the assumption is to be at the destination. To grasp the finality of the inevitable horizon, we must subject the end state to the most rigorous recursive thinking. We must interrogate the mechanics of inevitability until the concept of waiting dissolves entirely. Why is manifestation described as inevitable? Inevitability is not a promise of time, it is a mathematical certainty of consciousness. We must ask, how does the law decide what to produce in the physical world? The law is a neutral, mechanical reflector. It does not possess a moral compass or a sense of timing. It operates on the principle of dominance. If your consciousness is a glass vessel and you fill it with the assumption of having for 23 hours and 59 minutes and doubt for 1 minute, the volume of the assumption is so vast that the physical world has no choice but to conform to that pressure. The inevitability is the result of a mind that has reached a tipping point where the new reality is heavier than the old memory. Why does the law respond to what you are most of the time? This is the secret of the 3-0 second rule. Perfection is a phantom of the ego, a weapon used by doubt to convince you that you have failed because you wavered. But the law is not looking for a single, perfect moment of faith. It is looking for the natural resting place of your attention. Recursive question. Why is the resting place more important than the meditation? Because the resting place is your identity. A meditation is a visit, an identity is a home. If you use the 30-second rule to catch every doubt, you are ensuring that your identity remains anchored in the wish fulfilled. Over time, the neurological pathways of the assumption become so thick, so heavily myelinated, that they become the mind's default setting. When the mind drifts, it no longer drifts into fear. It drifts into the feeling of I have. At this stage, you are no longer working the law. The law is working you. How does the physical equivalent manifest without effort? Consider the mirror. If you stand still, the reflection has no choice but to stand still. If you move, the reflection follows. There is no delay in the mirror. There is only the appearance of delay in the physical world because our senses are slow to register the shift in the atmospheric density of our consciousness. Once the assumption is sustained without contest, once doubt is denied its 30 seconds of germination, the internal reality reaches a state of critical mass. The physical equivalent then precipitates into your life as naturally as water freezes when the temperature drops. You do not make the ice happen, you provide the cold. In the Chronicles of the Silent Empire, there was a story of a master architect named Orion who was tasked with crossing the abyss of the unmanifest. The abyss was a chasm of infinite depth, shrouded in a mist that swallowed sound and light. There was no bridge. There were no ropes. There was only a void. The king's counselors gathered at the edge, debating the physics of construction. They brought scrolls of engineering and piles of stone. They argued about the weight of the wind and the stability of the earth. They were reasonable men, respecting the evidence of the void. They spent their days proving that the crossing was impossible. Orion, however, stood at the precipice and closed his eyes. He did not look at the mist. He did not measure the gap. He turned his radio dial to the frequency of the other side. He spent 30 seconds inhabiting the feeling of the grass on the far shore, the scent of the pines, and the solidity of the ground beneath his feet. He made the assumption of arrival so heavy that the void behind his eyelids ceased to exist. As you witness Orion standing at the edge of his own impossible leap, recognize that you are standing at your own. The chasm between where you are and where you wish to be is made of nothing but the attention you give to the gap. If you are ready to let the bridge appear beneath your feet, signify your commitment to the path of the Master by liking and subscribing. Your journey into the unseen is the most important story ever told. Orion took a step. The counselors gasped, expecting him to plummet into the darkness, but as Orion's foot descended, a slab of translucent diamond appeared beneath it. He did not look down. He did not check to see if the diamond would hold. He took another step, and another. With each movement, the bridge materialized exactly where his foot landed. The bridge was not built in the traditional sense. It was a physical precipitation of Orion's internal certainty. He was not trying to cross. He was already there in consciousness, and the abyss was being forced to provide a floor for his assumption. Halfway across, a great doubt arose from the mist, a phantom wind that whispered, "What if the next step is the last? What if the diamond vanishes?" Orion felt the flicker. He heard the knock, but he practiced the 3-0 second rule as he walked. He gave the phantom 5 seconds of recognition. There is the wind, and 25 seconds of the far shore. The bridge remained solid. When Orion reached the other side, he looked back. The bridge was gone. The mist had returned. The counselors were still on the other side, arguing with the void. Orion realized that the bridge was not a permanent structure in the world. It was a temporary concession of the law to a mind that refused to acknowledge anything but its own greatness. The story of Orion is the final mandate for your existence. You are the architect of the unseen bridge. Your life is the chasm, and your desires are the far shore. The only thing that determines whether you walk on diamond or fall into the mist is your willingness to refuse doubt its 30 seconds of purchase. Starting tonight, your apprenticeship ends and your sovereignty begins. You are no longer a doubt hunter in training. You are a constant of consciousness. The final practice of the inevitable. The rule of 30. This is your one and only law. Doubt gets 30 seconds or less, every time. No exceptions for reasonable fears or urgent problems. If it is not the wish fulfilled, it is the missed. Catch it. Dismiss it. Return. The state of the finished work. Live from the end. When you walk through your day, do not look for signs that it is coming. That is the language of the divided house. Look at the world and see it as the evidence of your assumption. If the bank account is empty, see it as a temporary shadow cast by the gold that is already yours in the unseen. The assumption of greatness. Refuse to be small. Refuse to be a victim of circumstances. You are the one pointing the radio dial. You are the one who determines what the mirror must reflect. You have the blueprints. You have the tools. The 30 seconds that once felt like a battle will soon feel like a breath. As you step onto your own diamond bridge, remember that the only limit to your creation is the duration of your doubt. If this transmission has served as the light for your crossing, like and subscribe to remain part of the great architecture. Assume your greatness. Live from the end. It is done. The horizon is no longer distant. You are standing upon it. The physical world is beginning to blur at the edges, softening to receive the new shape of your soul. You have mastered the 30 seconds, and in doing so you have mastered time itself. But as the sun of this understanding reaches its zenith, you may find that the world you once knew has vanished entirely. What lies beyond the inevitable? What happens when the Creator realizes they are not just the weaver, but the thread itself? The final gate is opening. Until we meet again in consciousness, walk as the Master. The next chapter is not written in words, but in the very life you are about to live.